Mhm. I did read one. There was an article I read from the Brookings Institute. I think they're pretty well respected. And there was somebody that wrote an article that gerrymandering is actually less than it used to be.
Mhm. Yeah.
I was under the impression it was just as bad as ever, but apparently it's improved somewhat in the last 10 years, which I thought was encouraging. Uh,
Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah, it's one among many reforms that people have proposed. That's one. Getting rid of lobbyists would be a big one, but that's probably not going to happen. Um, other things like, first past the post voting systems. These are where, it's a all or nothing. There's some countries like Canada, for example, and I think several European countries have systems where if you when you vote, say in a national election, there's 4 parties, 4 candidates. You can rank them in order of preference. My first choice is this person, second choice, and if your first choice doesn't get it, then your vote goes to your second choice. So it's like, unlike the U.S. system, where if you vote for a loser, that's it. You may as well have not have voted. Whereas this gives your vote a little bit more meaning, because we can't always have what we want, so we sometimes have second choices. Hi, David. Are you there? Yeah. Hi, Lisa. I don't know if you can hear us, but welcome.
Thank you.
Yeah. And David, can you hear us? Okay. Yeah, I can't hear you. Maybe your mic is off. Can you hear us? Well, there it is. It's connecting. Can you hear us, David? All right. Okay, so yeah, we're at the moment, for those people who have already shown up, we're just killing time for a few more minutes till we get a few more people. Hey, David, can you hear me now?
Yes, yeah, I hear you.
Okay, good. I can hear you too. Good. All right. Yeah, we're just killing time right now till more people show up.
Hey, Victor.
Yeah.
Have you noticed? I think you mentioned this, but the Seattle Analytic Philosophy Group, it looks like it's exploded into just
Yeah.
hundreds of meetings.
Yeah.
Which
yeah, I don't know what's going on over there. I mean, I thought maybe you did.
Yeah, I was going to go to one the other day, but then I canceled out at the last minute. But I'll try to find out.
Yeah.
It's taken on like a massive federation explosion or something.
Yeah, I know. I remember when we started it. Gene, who was the last person I knew, who is he still running it? Gene?
I don't know. I see people from the entire world that seems
Yeah,
like.
yeah. Well, it started out. I was there in the first few years it started, and then it started out as a local club there in Seattle, and that's why it got the name. And now it's neither in Seattle nor is it analytic. It's barely philosophy anymore, and I guess it's still a club, but it's it's expanded into I would call it more of a culture club, where just about anything goes on any particular topic, and there are about dozens of organizers, and it's got thousands of members now. 6,000 or 7,000 people.
Of course, that does help if you wanted to organize, it wouldn't be everybody paying Zoom.
Yeah.
You just have to pay once and then
yeah.
pull the
Yeah. Well, I one time I was one of the organizers for that club, but that was before. And then Gene and I, who was I don't know if Gene is still there anymore, had a disagreement about how it was going to go, and I decided to start out and open this club, and he continued with that club for a long time. And I'm not even sure he's involved anymore, but I don't know. But I do know, I've noticed what you noticed, that it's become just this gigantic 6,000, 7,000 member club that talks about anything and everything anytime they want to. So
There was a film, there's a Toronto philosophy
yeah.
that's, I think, similar. Anyway, there's, I don't know, have you experimented much with the explosion of AI?
Yeah, I mean, not. I mean, you a few years ago we did something on AI, but not recently. I haven't.
Oh, I just meant like, have you tried out the Chat GPT?
I heard a little bit about it a few months ago. There was even an article. This was maybe a year ago. There was a controversy around this philosophical article, academic journal article that was written by Chat GPT or by some AI, and it was reviewed by professionals, real philosophers, and they thought it was a bad college student paper at best. It was not very good.
It's
But maybe it's gotten better since then.
It's everybody seems to be arguing about, definitions of understanding now.
Yeah.
Which the new Chat GPT and the other similar ones are really advanced.
Yeah.
And it's surprised me how good they are. Like, there's some people that will just say, "Oh, it's just statistics," wave their hand like that. But it's I don't know. It's arguably it can learn. Okay, so let me explain what, like, I asked it if my shoes could be both on and off at the same time, which was, I thought, was a test of the law of the excluded. I don't know, the law of non-contradiction, right? Can they be both on and off? And it said no, no, unless you've got one on and the other shoe off, which I thought was pretty good. So it figured out that kind of nuance. Pessimists would say, well, that was in the training data somewhere. Well, I don't know, really. Was that particular instance? The fact that it can seem to pick up on these sort of first principles like that is pretty impressive.
Yeah.
Anyway, I guess we're getting close to the
right. Okay. Yeah. Hi, Trevor. Can you hear us?
Yeah, I'm just
okay.
Eating, so I'm going to keep my camera off for a bit here.
Okay. All right. All right. I guess we'll get started now, and then people might trickle in later. Yeah. So first, I want to thank all those that are here for showing an interest in the topic, and you're welcome. And for the new people, there aren't too many new people here yet. I think everybody here has been here before, maybe. But yeah, I'm going to be sort of reading or presenting parts of this argument, and then pausing every now and then for people to comment on it or ask questions or argue or whatever about particular points, and then I'll come back and move it along to the next part of the topic. And for the people who haven't already been here before, and I actually think most of the people here now have an idea what this whole series of topics is about, but I'll go over it again just briefly. And right now, the topic today, just right now, that is part 4 of a 5-part series on in political philosophy, specifically on the notion of electoral representative democracy and how it is working or not working, as the case may be, and why say that, and what. And we delved in past parts into the nuts and bolts as to why that is, and it turns out to be pretty complicated because there are multiple layers here, and today will be, in a way, the 4th layer, and maybe the worst of the problems. And the next time will be the last part of this series, and it will be on, well, now that we've brought up all these problems, what kind of solutions, what could be done about it, if anything, because we'll review some of the likely solutions that have been proposed. next time. But briefly, I'll go over the 4 parts, including this one right now. In the first part, in those people who didn't see the first part, if you go to the description and if you click and read the extended write-up in the top of the write-up, there are links to extended write-ups on those previous parts. In part 1, we just talked about what democracy is, what the alternatives are, what kind of definition does it have. Is there more than one kind of democracy, or basically, and why is it important? Why is it say better than, as Churchill famously said, that it was the worst form of government except for all the others? Well, he didn't actually say why he thought that was the case, but a lot of people agreed with him. But we tried to get into why. Is it better than the others? There aren't that many other choices. As we said before, it's either one person who rules, that would be an autocracy, or everybody who's ruled who has to live under the government, that would be a democracy. And something in between, that would be an oligarchy, where a subclass of the whole set of the government governed do the governing. And so why would one of these 3 be better than the others? And we argued and discussed some of the arguments famous speakers had given as to why democracy really is the most defensible of those 3, and why that is. And there are multiple reasons, but the biggest one, the most, I think, in my opinion, most convincing one is that the other 2, the oligarchy and any form that comes in many forms, by the way, but we'll get to that later, and the autocracy, basically to make it oversimplify, infantilize the governed. It makes decisions for them as like parents might do for underage children, and that doesn't show them much respect for their own ability to know what's important and valuable for them when your parents have to be making these decisions for you. And that has, even when those decisions, if you left the children or the public to their own devices, might be bad decisions. There's nothing that says that you can't have an extremely wise, intelligent, capable dictator or king or a set of a subclass of people who really know what they're doing and are well-intentioned. All that's possible. It may well have happened at some point in history, but even under those, even with the best intentions, it doesn't do any honor or respect to the people who are governed. In a way, they need to make decisions, even when they make bad decisions, and hopefully they learn from them and develop and become better. It does something for the development of the governed, to have that responsibility and make their own decisions, even when they're not the best. That's the theory, anyway, behind what I identify that theory mostly with Kant and the deontological perspective, because that was what he valued more than anything else. There are other more practical reasons having to do with getting people, the large number of people invested in governance. It means that you're more likely to not allow dissent or people. Yeah, you're by giving people a voice, you're bringing them in as opposed to making them outsiders, and this might have good consequences in terms of them being unhappy with you. If you're a king, a dictator, and you make enough people angry, you might have your head cut off, or So it's a way to incorporate discontent among the governed in a way that possibly is constructive. So anyway, that was the original definition argument that we talked about, or one of the arguments we talked about in favor of democracy over the alternatives in that first part. And if you wanted a very short definition of what democracy is that I think captures what, without going into all the fine details, I think one of the best ones I run across is by the political philosopher named Alex Guerrero, who's at Rutgers. He calls it good governance by the governed. Now, what people ask, well, what is good governance? Well, if it's by the governed, it's whatever the governed call good governance. It's not someone outside the system who's deciding what's good and bad. It's the people who are having to live under the rules that are being made that decide what is good and bad. So anyway, that's enough for part one there. We can go back and read it if you want to delve into it further. Part two, we got into the other part of the electoral representative democracy concept, and that's the representative part. There are two major problems with actually, yeah, there's probably more than two, but there's one. One has to do with what we call the kinds of, okay, the perfect democracy or the pure democracy would be where everybody votes on everything all the time. And that's simply not practical at the scale of millions of people. So that's why that isn't taken too seriously, unless you're talking about a small community or a group the size of this group, for example, or the Supreme Court of the US, where there's 9 people. When you are able to speak and see and talk with and discuss things with people, get to know who they are, that kind of democracy in that context is as good as it gets. I mean, because nobody's representing anybody except they themselves are representing themselves. But when you get into millions of people, you need intermediaries like representatives, senators. The Congress is supposed to be doing that, be a go-between between what the people, the demos, the people who comprise the electorate, and the laws that are being made. They're the people who are supposed to represent the views of the larger population. Okay, then this raises questions about, well, what does it take to represent someone else? And then this leads to problems too, because what happens is that in the ideal situation, the representative knows and is very acquainted. What the philosophers use a term called epistemic intimacy. They're in a position to know what the people they represent, what their values are, what they want. And in whatever nuances you find there in the people who, the electorate should be reflected in the decisions that are made by the representatives. But given the nature of elections, there's a lot of watering down going on between what the average person wants and what the representative wants, to the point where one analogy that was brought up in the description for the next meetup is this, that electoral representation on the scale of millions is a little, as far as its effectiveness, it's a little bit like homeopathic medicine. I'm not putting down homeopathic medicine, by the way, but I mean, you can have your opinion about it, but it's the idea that a tiny bit of something can actually have an effect on, real effect on health. Sometimes called like cures like a bit of poison, just a molecular amount of poison can have a healthy effect on, making you immune or saving you from really being poisoned by that poison, by large doses of it. And in fact, it's been suggested that the whole idea of vaccines the underlying philosophical idea is actually similar to homeopathic medicine. And it does have some credibility, some of it does. But the problem with representation here is that it's like in much homeopathic medicine, it's just one single molecule of something. It's supposed to be curative in some way, but if you combine that with something called the placebo effect, where if people believe this, it might actually have an effect on someone. If you really believe that tiny molecule is going to make a difference, it's surprising how often it might actually make a difference. And so this could probably explain why we have put up with the existing representative system as long as we have, because if people are told it's representative long enough, and people go through the motions of making it look like it's representative, maybe that's all that you need. You don't need real representation. You just need to be cajoled or convinced that that's what you have, and then you'll start believing it, and then you'll buy into the system without asking, is your view really being represented in the laws that are being made by the country you live in? And so, belief in something might have real effect in terms of its explaining why it is that we haven't long ago revised or completely altered the system of government we have But if you look closely, as philosophers like to do, they want to know exactly what possible sense are our representatives representing us. When there are millions, sometimes millions of people being represented by one person in government, how can a million different opinions about things be reduced to just one, and one party or the other, or how can one person possibly represent that many people? It seems there's a lot of, this is what I mean by magical thinking. Seems to be a lot of magical thinking going on there, and to believe that this is possible at the scale of millions. But it could be a mass psychological illusion, but it may work, or has worked for a while. Well, whether it will continue to work is another matter, though, because if it turns out that the flaws or the problems with society keep getting bigger and bigger, and the representatives are not doing anything about it, you might, hopefully someday, people will wake up and say, is this really representative government or not? And so maybe the belief in the magical aspect of it will fade and people will wake up. But anyway, that was representation. And the other part of representation that came, I think, in that part of the last time is capture. This has to do with money and resources. And it's kind of, this one is, I think most people have certainly aware of this. This is the idea that to run in a national election like the United States as a senator or a member of the House of Representatives takes vast amounts of money, or for running for president. Last I heard, it's over $1 billion for each party to run a candidate for president. It takes big money to do that. Where are people going to get money? Suppose you have a well-intentioned politician who really is out to do the best they can for their constituents. They can't get elected, and they certainly can't stay elected unless they get a lot of money from somewhere. And who has that kind of money except people with that kind of money? And those people tend not to be ordinary citizens. They tend to be part of a subclass of the top 10%, to be precise, according to Martin Valens. And he's a political scientist at Princeton who about 7 or 8 years ago did a multi-decade study about showing the difference between what the average American on the street wanted from their government and what they actually got from the government. And there was no correlation at all for 90% of them. There was a correlation for 10% of them, those at the top income brackets. What they wanted is what government does. The rest might as well not even be voting. That's how little their vote counted in the scheme of things. And he concluded by saying that America was a democracy in name only, meaning, again, calling it a democracy is a bit antiquated. It isn't a democracy. It fits the classic description of an oligarchy, more specifically a plutocracy, or even more specifically nowadays, some people are calling it a technocracy or epistocracy. A plutocracy is like ruled by those with money. Epistocracy is like ruled by those who are of a certain have a certain education or expertise, that have knowledge or in a position to know how to do it. And technocracy is even more specific. And here they're talking about the big tech companies who have a great deal of control over how communication is happening in modern societies. In the links, there's a link to John Gray, who's a British historian and philosopher of ideas, who talks about this. If you guys want to watch it, it's a couple of interviews with him. I know David knows who he is. Anyway, right, and then so capture is the fact that the people with money basically put these politicians in their pocket, and they're not going to do anything about anything that would harm the interest of the people with the money. And the rest of us, we're going along for the ride. That's all we can do. Anyway, so finally today, this time, I'm getting around to the topic that I want to focus here is these getting away from the more specific problems and getting here to a more abstract problem. What is really going on here? And it seems to me the problem is a concentration of power, or concentrations of power, plural. These can be anywhere. They can be, traditionally, it was government. And it used to be, there was a time when, say, government was the most powerful in the US, that would be the federal government entity literally around, the authority, the ultimate authority. But it's no longer necessarily even governments anymore. Private parties that are not accountable through elections can also become concentrations of power whose ability to control the lives of vast numbers of people can extend throughout not only the country, but even the world. And these concentrations of power are so large now that it's that countries themselves can be bought and sold. Like, not just, they're not, what's wrong with these is that they're not accountable to anyone. And at least governments and democratic countries, in theory at least, could be, if they didn't please the electorate, the old saying about throw the bombs out, you could replace them with other bombs that you like better. But there's no kind of accountability for these large multinational, transnational organizations who often are aligned and connected with governments in a way, because governments need money, and these people tend to have money. So and it's hard to, so these concentrations of power have developed to such an extent that at least one political philosopher, Elizabeth Anderson, has started to refer to two kinds of government out there: public and private government. Public government is what we all know as the kinds like in Washington, or the state governments, or the governments that are at least in liberal democratic parts of the world supposedly accountable to the electorate. Private governments are those who don't amass their power through any kind of election, but through sheer material firepower. The fact that they have the money to make things happen, that even governments need to cozy up to them to get this power to accomplish anything. These are the private governments. She calls them governments because what they do shapes the lives of people in the same way that public governments do, except that unlike public ones, they aren't accountable to voters. So who are they accountable to? Well, there used to be a time when the public governments would make laws that would govern these transnational corporations and transnational concentrations of power. But that sharp division between government and these private concentrations is no longer there. There's growing evidence that they're pretty much becoming one. They're merging into, in a somewhat negative sense, public-private partnerships, to the point where you can't even tell which is private and which is public anymore, and who's pulling the strings and who's supposed to be, whose strings are being pulled. And anyway, so what all this is leading to is that, of course, if these are the power centers that are controlling people's lives, then democracy is just not even remotely in the picture anymore. If by democracy we mean that the governed are the ones that are the ultimate sources of power and are deciders of what is done. So then the next, well, I'm going to pause here. I'm going to talk about later, but after I pause right now, about transparency and accountability, because those are the only ways that we can imagine how you can control these concentrations of power. But before I go any further, does anybody want to comment or say anything right now as far as anything I've said? Go ahead.
Well, just a quick comment. When you're talking about a private government, it seems like Russia is kind of like that now. I don't think the public can really alter the course, the way things are set up now, and it's mostly a subset of the population that's really rich, that's really making all the rules, which it seems to be what happens is whatever happens is kind of at their whim.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Does anybody have any comments about that? David, you know something about Russia, right? Or
Well, not that much, but I mean, I'd say that I think that the politicians in Russia are worried about what the results of the elections are going to be, just as much as they are anywhere else. I really don't see that, and the information that's coming out is that they're really quite popular.
in the public, among the Russian public.
Yeah, the politicians, the people running the government are really quite popular among the people in general, in contrast to a lot of other places.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, I know that the media in the West is, it's just gone into full propaganda mode on many, many things. And I think that a tremendous amount of evidence is coming out that almost everything they told us about this whole COVID debacle has been false. And I think there's a lot of other things that are like that too. The corporate media is really concentrated in a few hands, and they seem to work together with the government and a lot of other big interests in the West. And so I don't know whether we in the West should really be looking down our nose at a lot of other places. I mean, there are a lot of banana republic features that have crept into American political life.
Yeah. Yeah. Does anybody else want to say anything? All right. Okay, so I'm going to.
It's a philosophy.
What? Okay. All right. I want to talk about, to give an example of one of these concentrations of power, or one that really strikes me as being like a glaring example of one of it. And there's more than one, and that's the problem. And these concentrations of power seem to be dictating world affairs, not even national affairs, but world affairs across, borders. But we'll use an example from the U.S. because I have data for this, and you can find more details about it in the write-up. And I talked a little bit about this last time, but I didn't talk about this phrase that I don't think I did, called, Angus Deaton is a Nobel laureate economist who's a defender of liberal democracy and open markets and the ideal of capitalist economics. He's a professor at Princeton. He and his wife, Ann Case, are both top-notch economists, establishment economists. So they're not socialists or leftists or disbelievers in the capitalist system. But they recently wrote a book called, and I mentioned this last time, no, just mentioned the book, is The Death of Despair. I mean, go back to that description to see why it's called that. But what stuck out to me from listening to one of their lectures, which you can find in the write-up, is they referred to the healthcare system in the US as and this is their word, $1 trillion protection racket. Which is a phrase from organized crime. That's pretty serious accusation from someone who actually defends the capitalist system about what's going on in the healthcare system. So this is coming from, not an outsider's perspective. And what do they mean by that? Why $1 trillion? And well, just and these facts are from them, from their book, and also from their lectures, which you can find in the write-up. But here's what they mean. Each of the 535 members of the US Congress, each one of those members, has 4 full-time and well-heeled lobbyists from one industry alone hovering over their shoulders to make sure these lawmakers make no changes that would disturb the carefully crafted network of laws and policies designed to serve the financial interest of the healthcare industry. In other words, nothing happens that's going to change that, because these people, it's not in their interest for that to happen. And with 4 of these people hovering over each one of our lawmakers, it's not a wonder that things haven't changed a long time ago. I mean, these people have money. These lawmakers need money to stay elected. It's kind of obvious why nothing changes. Or if it does change, it changes with a view toward PR, or public relations. You change things, you create a new law that sounds good, and then you sell it to the public, and then you can say, we did something. But in effect, it did next to nothing to change the system. But it's about convincing the public to stay in there. We're making progress, and so on. And who are this? By the healthcare industry, they mean something much perhaps bigger than what people think. They have in mind, and this is where the $1 trillion comes in, not just medical professionals, doctors, pharmaceutical companies, medical equipment companies, health insurance companies, hospitals, medical schools, health research institutions, but also extensions of these, including so-called nonprofit organizations or government regulatory agencies like the FDA, CDC, the World Health Organizations, up to and including the United Nations and European healthcare authorities. It's that big, and not only that, a lot of how come we haven't heard about this before? Well, it's because of the media. The media too is involved in this. This is why it takes trillions of dollars to pull this off. That's a lot of people involved, and a lot of money has to change hands to have that kind of power, and who's got that kind of money? And this is what we mean by concentration of power. It's no longer about nations. It's about things that are bigger than any one nation. Conglomerates. It's hard to define what they are, but and it's not like they're necessarily conspiracies here in the old-fashioned sense of a conspiracy, where you've got technically a conspiracy is like a few people who are joining forces for nefarious ends, where they sit down and maybe some of these conspiracies of that sort are actually pretty hard to pull off for very long. It's more, what we're describing here, something more organic, something that occurs just because of the nature of modern society, the global, the way that societies or human interests are becoming increasingly global, where you can't just do something in one country and have it not affect some other part of the world as well. The drug companies, the pandemic, and it's a good example of this. It had to be a global thing. It couldn't be just a problem for one country here or there. It had, and this is not new. This sort of thing has happened in the past, although it does seem to be becoming bigger and stronger than ever these days. But way back, some of us will remember the military-industrial complex, which is still there. But even people like Eisenhower warned us about it way back in the 50s. And then there was the banking crisis of 2008. Who's supposed to be watching so that those kinds of things don't happen? There are these concentrations of power behind all of these historical breakdowns. And
Victor,
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, just one thing. You mentioned the Eisenhower warning us about the military-industrial complex. What he was essentially doing, Dwight Eisenhower, General Eisenhower, was telling us that he had been unable, he was doing that, he said this when he left office in 1960. And he was admitting that he had not been unable to control it. And if he couldn't, who can? That's all. Okay.
Yeah, that's a good example of a concentration of power that was bigger than any one president of the United States. He was president of the United States for 8 years, I believe. And this was a long time ago, and it hasn't gotten better since then. It's only gotten bigger, and these concentrations have just gotten bigger, to the point where it's hard to imagine, well, where is it going? Who on earth could possibly stop them or be a check on these concentrations of power? Because they're bigger than governments. They're bigger than the most powerful government on the planet. The most powerful government on the planet, that of the United States, may well be part of one, if not several. And then so what is there to do about this? What can be done about it? That's what we meant by, it's an example of what I mean by concentrations of power. It's kind of an abstract idea. It's hard to say, to put the boundaries on it and say, well, this part of society is part of the concentration. This part isn't. It's because it's so neatly interconnected. The social media, for example, is connected with big pharma, for example, and government and international organizations. She isn't here tonight, but we have but we have a member of this group who, and I won't mention her name because she may have reasons not to be named, who was worked for the United Nations in the UK as some people may know who I'm talking about, but she worked as a consultant for the United Nations on human rights and based in the UK. She was a writer. And she was struck by in recent events during the pandemic of how any kind of dissent anybody within the United Nations establishment who wasn't towing a certain line from the top was being basically suppressed. And she was seeing this happen in this transnational organization. And she saw it on a pretty large scale. This wasn't even a particular nation, this is transnational. It's like it's no longer, you can't point your finger at this or that corporation or this or that government. I mean, you can, but they're just a small part of this. Something bigger than all of that. Fine. So let's see. Okay, the next idea, unless somebody else wants to interrupt here and say something, because go ahead, Trevor.
I think there actually is a way that this could be dealt with. I think if there was a social media platform where philosophy, particularly epistemology, was a first-class concept, and with strict practice and enforcement, I think it could make a huge difference. If you just take these if you just take the congressional hearings on TikTok as kind of an example, all of the footage and testimony from these hearings are being played on TikTok, and the politicians are getting lit up. Like, they have unified, with one bad move, they've unified 150 million Americans. Well, presume there's 150 million TikTokers. I don't know what percentage of those are furious at Congress, but I suspect it's pretty big. But it displayed in full color in these nice little 30-second to 2-minute sound bites that democracy is not just an illusion, it's a farce. It is, everyone is reading from the same script. At least 50% of these people asking questions clearly don't have like even the slightest clue what they're talking about. And they're making all these accusations. They're asking questions that are not yes or no questions, and then they're forcing the TikTok dude to answer with a yes or no. The whole thing is such a farce, and it's surreal because they're attacking TikTok. And TikTok is being used in response to demonstrate how fake democracy is, which shows you why they're going after TikTok, because it's the most potent platform for propaganda, anti-US government propaganda. But an even more powerful platform could be built in this, one that exercises extremely high level epistemology, that overcomes all of our culturally ingrained instinctive behaviors. Like, culturally, we insist on, if you crank up the epistemic strictness of any topic, people just start dropping like flies. And not just like flies, they will fail in highly predictable ways. So all of this, with a sophisticated platform, I think could blow things open.
You're talking about like a new non-existing social media platform that would
something entirely new. Yep.
That would be kind of like a watchdog on government policies.
No, just a platform. It doesn't have to do anything in particular. It just happens to have the capability to skillfully practice epistemology. In fact, if you were actually going to make this successful, it would be a wise idea to draw a wide circle around the government and not go anywhere near them until you have the user base trained. Then you could go after the government.
Yeah, well, I'm wondering, like, who would direct or lead this social media platform? I mean, who would be? You're talking about something that just grows up organically from the public at large, or would?
Well,
or
I mean,
it wouldn't be
come to
it
be
would be a
anyways.
for-profit company, would it? I mean, it would, or what are you thinking? Who would?
I would ask the question of, if it is for profit or not for profit, does either of those necessarily cause it to fail?
Yeah,
See, as you're contemplating this, use strict epistemology, right? Because always we're hallucinating reality. Whenever you're referencing the future, it's a hallucination. But culturally, we're not allowed to talk about that, right? When you're referencing the past, it's a hallucination. When you're discussing the present, anything that is not here is a hallucination. We don't talk about these things in Western cultures. In fact, anyone that mentions them gets attacked.
yeah. I'm just wondering how. Are you saying? Well, I think there already are a few, for example, alternatives to YouTube out there. I know YouTube is practicing a lot of censorship, but
Nothing practices epistemology.
right. So there isn't any actual example of what you're talking about in existence already. Okay. And by
There's lots of
practicing it,
examples of the very opposite of it.
okay,
All
okay,
the platforms.
okay. When you say practice epistemology, what exactly do you mean by that? I mean, I know what epistemology means in philosophy, but what is it? You know,
Well,
you mean just people who are just trustworthy or have high standards?
no, just define a whole bunch of rules. If you state an opinion in the form of a fact, bang, delete the comment. One negative point, you get 7, you're off. And eventually what you do is you weed out all the people who, it's just like if you're having a marathon, right? To compete in a certain marathon, you have to reach certain things to compete. If you simply are not able to practice epistemology, you're not allowed on the platform. And before you know it, what you've done is filtered out so that the 2% of the population at a snapshot in time who do have the ability, that's who you're left with. Right?
And they're the ones who would be controlling things, right? Is that what you're saying? They would be the thought leaders, or
Who would be controlling things would be who would be controlling things. So if you want to run a optimal platform, you seek what is the optimal answer to that design question.
okay. Well, and what it sounds, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like you're talking about is creating an epistocracy, an epistocratic elite of a certain people, a certain class of people who really have these standards you're referring to, and putting them in positions of power. Or
No. Where did this idea of positions of power come from?
Well, if they're filters for information, is that what you're saying? But what's their function?
Oh, it's you enforce the rules.
And who makes the rules exactly?
The community.
Okay.
It's a recursive process. There's no other way to practice epistemology.
The community meaning just anybody who wants to be part of this.
Yeah, and when they make an epistemic error, it is rejected, and you say, try again.
Okay, well, this reminds me of
It's the same as math class. It's the same as math class. If a student answers 1 + 1 and they put 3, the teacher will say, the answer to that is not 3. The answer is 2. And then they will learn.
right. Well, I'm thinking of an example, or at least maybe it's an example of a failure of this, and that's Wikipedia. In the early days, it really was an attempt. That's how I understood it, for a gathering of all human knowledge, and people got to basically check on each other to make sure they got it right. Somebody would put out a definition of a history of something, and somebody would come along and correct it because they knew more about it, and somebody else would correct them, and so on. So it was what do they call it? I forget what they call it. Anyway, it was an appeal in the belief that if you just allow anybody out there who might know something about a subject to help create a storehouse of knowledge that was vetted by the community as a whole. So if anything, some wrong things, some false things might get in there, but somebody who knows would come along and point it out and correct it.
Mm.
And if they were biased, somebody else would come along and correct them, and so on. Is that sort of like what you have in mind? So a community based.
It only a very little bit. So what you're encountering is the problem of volume, right? So a
Yeah.
way to think about this is can you filter 5 million gallons of water with a Brita water filter from your fridge? No. That's what Wikipedia is kind of trying to do. So just alter the volume to a capacity that you can handle.
Okay.
Because the goal is not in vetting all disagreements or finding the truth. Goal number one is for human beings to be able to skillfully and reliably distinguish between hallucinated reality or opinion or what they've been trained to believe. Like, for example, look at the Ukraine conversations. Look how they describe them. They tell us little stories on TV, and people get indoctrinated into these stories. And then if someone disagrees, there's a whole set of responses that people have been trained on. If you question the narrative, they will say you're a Russian troll. They will say you're a conspiracy theorist. They will say you think you are very smart. They will say, and it's just like ChatGPT, there's a probabilistic set of responses that will come because human beings are basically biological large language models, right? When you present an idea to a human, what comes back will follow a normal distribution. And the reason for that is because humans are trained like a large language model. They ingest information. The information they ingest follows a normal distribution according to the community they're in.
Mhm.
So if you just take these simple principles and develop a solution for it and try not to get a bullet in your head in the process, I think we could have a pretty nice world 10, 20 years from now.
Right. Anybody else have any thoughts on this? Yeah. Yeah, I'm just trying to understand, like, there are rules that would make this work, and who would be, you said the rule makers would be the community. The community must be anybody with an interest in it. Anyone who takes an interest in being a member of that community would in theory have some input. Is that, and that could be anybody, right? Is that what you have in mind, Trevor?
I would open it to be anybody, and then I would have my moderator thing ready to just start chopping people down. As soon as you start expressing your opinion as fact, bang, gone,
Okay.
gone, just like Sauron in Lord of the Rings. And what will be left standing is some people are going to notice what you're doing. They're going to be right. I see what you're doing here. You are practicing strict epistemology and logic.
Right.
And they're going to be like, I happen to know how to do that too. Next thing you know, instead of there being one person, there will be 10 or 100 or 1,000.
Yeah, but I'm concerned about these people who would be doing the sorting out of the opinions from the facts.
Mm.
Is there a general, universally accepted storehouse of facts out there that everybody in the world can agree with? I just
We're not signing off on facts. We're pointing out epistemic flaws.
Well, be an example of one.
If you say this platform will turn into what Wikipedia turned into, you're referencing the future, therefore it's necessarily opinion, but you've stated it in the form of fact -1. You get 7 of those 1 week, you're off the platform.
Hmm.
And if people like being on the platform, they will learn from the mistakes of others.
Hmm.
Even just getting people to stop stating their opinions as facts, that'll cut errors by 50%. I bet you with 5 rules, I could eliminate 90% of errors on social media.
Yeah. Well, what if people, instead of stating their opinions as facts, just stated their opinions and said there are no facts, there's just opinions?
Then I will say, present a proof of that claim that there are no facts. And if you don't do it within 24 hours, you're off the platform.
Okay, so there's a proof procedure or a set of criteria, things you must do to distinguish what you're saying from being an opinion to being a fact. And that's what I'm trying to get at. What are those that criteria, the filter that sorts these things out? What is it, and who decides what it is? And, or are you referring to like what?
But not everything is a matter of opinion. Okay, like, can we agree that there's the notion of the future?
It depends on who you're talking. I know philosophers of time who actually deny the future. They deny the past too.
But I'm not asking about them. If you listen to my sentence, I said, do we, you and me, Victor,
Yeah.
do you agree that there is a future, this notion within humanity of the future?
If you're asking me, since I'm familiar with those time arguments, I don't have an opinion about it, really. I mean, like everybody else out there, I behave as though there's a future. I behave as though there's a past. I behave as though there's a present. But that's not about ideas. That's about our conditioning, how we interact with our environment, and it's not philosophical. What?
Okay, so here's another notion. What you'll find with human beings is they operate in these different modes. Sometimes they'll operate in an agreeable mode, and sometimes they'll operate in a disagreeable mode. I operate in the disagreeable mode 99% of the time. I love it. I really enjoy disagreeing with people.
Yeah.
However, this is not an optimal way to behave all the time. So when you're talking about something like when I say, is there a future? It's interesting that when the topic of discussion is epistemology, suddenly just plain old uncontroversial things like, is there a future? People are like, they're very, normally they'd have no problem with that. But as soon as you put the notion of epistemology into play, everyone immediately starts acting very strange. Ideas like nothing's real. I could be the only person here. We could all be a brain in the jar. There's no future. There's no past. These are very good conversations you can have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But the point is to watch people's behavior. So there's many different tricks you could pull on them. You can get them to answer a whole bunch of questions, right? And then when they start lying, so then when you're on another topic and they start lying, then what you can say, wait a minute, this doesn't line up with all your questions from over here. Got ya. And there's a zillion things you could do. And you don't have to be smart. It's not that I'm smart. It's just that I've paid attention to how our culture works.
Yeah.
And our culture works. Think of pre-scientific times when their culture ran on pure religion. Can we admit that was a bit less of a bit lower epistemic quality than what we have today when we're largely driven by science? Okay, so then the question is, have we reached peak human ability here in 2023? I'm guessing that maybe we have. How much upside is it?
Well, I would agree with you, although I think that many people would disagree with both of us. They would say that religion is far away from being dead.
Oh yeah, and I'm one of those people. I'm a big fan of religion. I think it's great.
David, were you going to say something?
I was just going to say, we try to define a scientific fact, and if you actually look into this and study it, I know we were talking yesterday, Victor and I, about Thomas Kuhn, but actually there's somebody who comes even before that, named Ludwig Fleck, who wrote about this, and Thomas Kuhn cribbed a lot of his material into his writings, and that really they see that scientific facts change all the time. They're actually produced by groups of scientists who form a thought collective. That's Fleck's term, and result in a paradigm, and a paradigm becomes accepted generally, and then it can be overthrown, and so on. So to think that there even is such a thing as an irrefutable fact the basic principles of the understanding of anything. What is heat? What is light? And so on. Keeps changing. It changes over the years, over the centuries.
So
Sometimes
there's no facts.
huh?
There's no facts at all. Zero facts in reality.
There are facts, but they're not as absolute and clear cut as you think. I mean,
How do you know what I think?
I don't. Well, as you've been saying, as I surmise that you.
Did I actually say that though?
Well, you're saying somebody who steps outside of a certain Overton window gets eliminated, but that Overton window is something that's changes and is.
You don't know the Overton window I'm describing. You have a model.
No, I don't
Your
know.
mind has created a model, and you're describing that. See
No,
how
I don't.
strict I am. See how strict I am. Any mistake, I'll nail you.
Well, any scientific, anything you seem to be talking about scientific facts as if there's something that we can be absolutely certain on and it's going to be unchanging.
Right. But that's how it seems.
It does seem that way, but it's not.
Correct.
Okay, I'm just saying it's not. And
See, but all you have to do is go through about 3 or 4 hours of this, and all of these things will get washed away. And before you know it, everyone will be on the same page. And they're like, I see. What we're doing is washing away all this cultural, intuitive grunge. And it will be like practicing science in a laboratory with professionals.
I think it would be more like practicing groupthink. That's usually what happens, and that's
why do you think that though?
That's what a scientific paradigm is, because that's the way things seem to work. I have a saying that I like, and it's a good guide, and it's called "De omnibus dubitandum," Latin, doubt everything. It comes from theology. It applies equally to science.
Okay, so are you referencing reality or virtual reality when you say this?
What is reality? We don't know.
Well, so this platform doesn't exist.
This is Pontius Pilate's very excellent question. What is truth?
Okay, so do you agree that Facebook exists?
Yeah, you can go on the internet and you see there's a Facebook. Okay.
Do you agree there was a time when Facebook did not exist?
Yeah.
Okay. At the time when Facebook did not exist, if someone was to describe Facebook to you, would you have been able to, at that time, would you have been able to make accurate, necessarily accurate, fine-grained predictions about what would and would not happen on Facebook in the future?
To some extent, you might. And you might be able
necessarily,
to
notice this word I used.
Hey, this is a possibility to go by. Necessarily, no. Okay. But no, but you can't do that about anything. And
but what are you doing? But what are you doing right now? What are you doing right now?
I'm right here.
No, but are you not making predictions into the future about what if this platform was to come into existence? Are you not saying that you necessarily know what's going to happen on it?
No, I don't know. I don't know necessarily anything, and I don't think anybody else does either. So,
okay, so you're expressing your opinion. So now we know we have
somebody can necessarily know that this was going to happen, or anything necessarily. Even the hard scientists like science like physics keeps changing.
Okay, I want to interrupt the conversation.
Maybe it isn't going anywhere. So
no, it's actually an interesting conversation.
Isn't it interesting though? These things are very easy to predict how people will, right. Because there's a normal distribution, and all you have to do is start writing down these things, and then you'll have a bunch of rules, and you just ban these behaviors.
Right. Boom. Yeah, and we have in the past actually dealt with we had a topic called "What is Knowledge," which was about epistemology, and my preferred definition of knowledge is that it comes from a description, an advertising description for a type of headache remedy that was called. They referred to it as having extra strength, longer lasting relief. Well, knowledge is extra strength, longer lasting belief. but that's what it is. It's a super strong belief, but like any belief, it could be wrong. I'm reserving the term fact or knowledge for something that is impossible to overthrow, which, as far as I know, maybe is nothing at all. But that's an interesting topic in epistemology. And although at some point it is connected with the topic today, it's a little bit specific and really somewhere else. Because
it shows you that once you get serious about solutions,
yeah,
you can turn desire.
Yeah.
If you get too serious, people's desire for a solution will turn into an aversion.
Maybe so. Yeah. The kind of knowledge that's relevant to political theory or political philosophy is the kind that you shouldn't need to be an epistemologist to have. Just knowing what it is you want from the society around you, and that's the first thing. If you don't even know that, then democracy is not going to be of much help to you. You have to have some kind of wish or desire for that things be a certain way. There's that. And then the second part is, well, even if you have those desires, how on earth are you going to have them met or realized in society? Or is there even an opportunity for you to have them met or realized? That's the extent of the kind of knowledge that is presupposed by this discussion, as far as I'm concerned. But I mean, there certainly are thorny problems with the very nature of knowledge, as you pointed out, but I don't think they're really critical to what we're doing right now. So I want to move on to one of the that it's discussed at length in the write-up. I don't know if people had a chance to read it, but one of the responses that when I brought up these ideas to people, and one response is they really believe that that it's possible. They'll admit that politicians can be corrupted and so forth, but they do believe that it's possible, nevertheless, to resist this corruption. That they have this really strong faith that not everyone who's in a position of power is automatically corrupted in virtue of having that power. Okay, they often people say that as though they have, in my view, they have tremendous faith in human capabilities to say that. And I'm not saying that there's never been a person who's been absolutely incorruptible, but I think there's pretty good science to suggest that the overwhelming majority of people, of the electorate, the people who vote, the people who put these people in power, are highly corruptible themselves. And so if you have a genuinely representative, then he has to have, or she has to have, all the flaws of the people they're representing. And the people they're representing are not angels or saints. They're put them in the right position, and they too will behave in the way that they're accusing the politicians of behaving. And what proof is there for this? Well, there have been moralist philosophers going back to the ancient Greeks, to Diogenes of Sinope, the original cynic who went around Athens with a lantern in broad daylight, looking for an honest man, and wasn't able to find one. And then there have been many other philosophers who pointed this out, but people can dismiss them as being, just observational comments by this or that person. Is there any really genuine science that suggests that people in general, by in general, doesn't mean everyone, but it does mean most people are highly corruptible? Well, recently, in the past 10, 15 years, there has been a lot of study on that question. And in the write-up, I cite a behavioral economist who specializes in understanding how rational or irrational people are. His name is Daniel Ariely, and he's written tons of books about this. He's a big name in the area. He's a commentator for the New York Times, NPR, and a whole bunch of other places. You can find him doing YouTube TED Talks, at least half a dozen of them on the subject. And they're really engaging. But he did, what he was trying to figure out is, are ordinary people corruptible? And the answer is, using scientific methods to figure it out. And the answer is overwhelmingly yes. And as I described in the write-up, one of his experiments was to test deception, how how likely are people to lie? Ordinary people, not politicians or not evil people either, just random people off the street. He describes an experiment where he had test subjects come in, and the experimenter would have them toss a die, as in dice, with 6-sided die, and whichever side came up, whatever number came up or came down, which of those two would be determined by the test subject in advance of the toss. Let's say you toss the die and it ends up with 6 up. They would get $6. If they said before they toss the die that whatever comes up is that I want that amount. Or if they had said whatever is on the downside of that die, I want that amount. But they have to say that, they have to make that decision which side is going to determine how much money they get before they actually toss the die. But here's the catch. They would be asked, tell me which side you want to govern, how much money you get after we toss this die. But don't tell me the answer. Don't write it down. Keep it in your head. Okay. And then I'll ask you after we toss the die, what side you picked. So, and this experiment was repeated thousands of times, across very large demographics. There was no difference between men, women, people of different ages, different groups. It was consistent. 90% of the time, people were very lucky. They always guessed that whichever side turned out to have the most money is what they had previously decided in their own heads was the side that would determine how much money they would get. Now, the thing is, each subject only got to do this one time. And there was no way the experimenter could know whether they were lying or not. Any given individual was completely insulated from being identified as a liar because they might have been telling the truth. How would you know if you're an experimenter? Remember, there was no proof of what they actually thought in their head. They were asked which way they had decided beforehand because they weren't supposed to tell anybody, not even the experimenter, not write it down or anything. They were only asked which side they had decided prior to the toss, after the toss, not before. So 90% of the time, people guessed that it worked out that they always got, whatever the larger number was, they got more money that way. Interestingly, 10% of the time, they didn't. What that suggested was that, and that 10% in a way was more interesting because these were people who apparently told the truth, even when it was against their interest to do so, even when there was no way on earth they could possibly be shown to have lied, because this is something in your head. And yet they apparently, his speculation was that I guess 90% of people will, lie. At least on the amount of money they got was like $1 per every dot. So if they came up six, they would get $6. That 90% of people would lie, and that's what it turned out, and 10% didn't. But they could not put a finger on any one person being a liar. It's just like a statistical outcome. The other interesting thing was that, so what does this say? What conclusion did he draw? For one thing, why did this 10% not lie? And he figured that 10% of the population is the kind of people who would not sleep well if they knew they had lied about something to gain money. But this is a small minority of people. These are people who would genuinely be incorruptible, because there's no way they could be, you could put your finger on and say they lied. They only knew that 90% of them lied because of the statistics, not because they had any evidence against any one person. So they also found that the same thing applied to stealing. They were in a similar situation. Test subjects were asked to decide how much money their time was worth when for participating in the experiment. And they were handed an envelope with $50 in it, and they would be asked, well, how much money do you think your time is worth? If they said, say, $25 or something, they say, okay, here's an envelope. Take your $25 on the way out, unobserved, and put what's left over in a big bin, sealed. The envelope was sealed in a bin where nobody could see it, along with tons of other envelopes from other people. So they were basically being asked to pay themselves whatever they said they would pay themselves, but with no way to know whether or not they really took what they said they would take from the envelope. And they could not find that pin stealing on any given individual because there was no way to know whether this person or that person was dishonest. But they did know, could tally up the money and know that people were in fact taking more money than in fact they said they would take. But maybe this isn't that surprising to people that, and this was a vast majority of people, there was always a minority of people who didn't. So that doesn't mean everybody's a liar and a cheat, but a huge number of people are. But another interesting thing is, it also mattered how much was at stake. For example, in the dye experiment, if it was just $1 per dot, 90% of people lied. But if you were to increase that to $60 or $600 per dot, suddenly the lying went down. Even though there was more financial incentive to lie, the amount of lying went down. And why was that? And this was consistently repeated in the experiment. And his conclusion was that although most people are okay with lying a little bit, they're not okay with lying big time, because they start to as he speculated, they have a high sense of self. Their self-worth is tied to, they have an opinion about themselves, that they're not really bad people. And if they have no problem with little lies, but big ones, they do start to have qualms about. So as the amount of money, the stakes went up, people lied less, indicating that they didn't want to lie or cheat anymore. Even though they would not have been found out, they still lied less just because the amount of money involved was greater. That of course was 90%. There were, of course, a small 10% who, of course, did lie. These were the psychopaths, or the people who would only had no conscience or concern other than to maximize their own material well-being, and there was no chance they could be caught. So from their purely rational, self-interested position, it makes sense to lie all the time if you stand to lose nothing and stand to gain something. But his point was that that's if you're rationally interested. But he found that many people were not rationally self-interested. Beyond a certain point, we're all a little bit that way, but not so extreme that we're willing to exploit a system for all it's worth, and which was interesting. So how does this relate to what we're talking about here? It relates in this sense is that I'm addressing again those very optimistic people who think that it is possible for a person in a position of power to not be corrupted. That it's just those other people, the people in the other party from yours that are the liars, but your own people are not. By the way, that led to another experiment he did. This one involves in-group versus out-group. And a good way to illustrate this is they found that if a person is caught doing some kind of wrongdoing and they're a member of an out-group that you're not a part of, your own behavior will become more honest as a result, knowing about what these other people are doing who are not part of your in-group. An example would be if, let's say, a politician was caught cheating in some way that was, and it was publicized. This would have a positive effect on the honesty of Democratic politicians, because there would be a tendency to think, well, that bad stuff, that's what those guys do. We don't do that. But if it's one of your own, if it's a Democratic politician who's caught lying, that actually increases the same kind of behavior among their own peer group, among their own group, their in-group. Because the thinking there must be, well, if one of my own does it, it must be okay to do it. And so it matters a lot on who it is that is being caught out by these things as to how acceptable one's malfeasance or bad behavior is. If it's part of that group, I'm not part of that group, so it augments my self-esteem. I'm part of the good group. If it's one of my own group, well, it must not be such a bad thing if people like me are doing it. It must be okay. This is what he learned from this. And this, of course, gets magnified when politicians try to decide what they're going to do, whether or not, for example, they're going to accept money or listen to people who they know aren't representative of their constituents, but who have money, which it must strike some of them as being dishonest. After all, that's not how they when they were running for office, they didn't say to their constituents, I'm going to do whatever the people that give me the most amount of money want me to do, therefore vote for me. That's not what they told their constituents, but that's in fact what their behavior was. So if ordinary people are this way, and if it's true that politicians are drawn from the class of ordinary people, then that is pretty predictable that they are also liable to behave the way ordinary people are. And by and large, not that there aren't exceptions, but and those exceptions are interesting in their own way, because there might be an honest person out there, but if by some chance manages to get enough money to get elected and stay elected, and they still stand by their principles, they're not likely to be very efficacious. They're going to be perhaps kept like an ornament, a trophy, some kind of indication that you see our system works. Even that guy is still in office, even though he never he's powerless. He doesn't accomplish anything, but at least it's a token of honesty. Anyway, so does anybody have any thoughts about this? Because what this is addressing is the idea that it is possible in theory, to get representatives to not to resist corruption, the corruptive influences that are trained upon them. And it's not impossible that it could happen, but it is highly unlikely that it will happen on a large scale. And it's kind of predictable that that's going to happen, because where are these people coming from? Unless you believe, and perhaps some people do, that just being a politician makes you a more honest, a more decent person than your average constituent is. That you're drawn into politics because you're an exceptionally honest person, that's a qualification for being a politician. I don't think that's the case. I think most politicians, the successful ones, the ones that get elected and stay elected, are probably there because of their really excellent ability to persuade people of things. Whether they're persuading them of good, right, or wrong things is another question, but their persuasiveness is their skill that makes them good politicians, not their honesty. That's not a particularly high virtue. At least maybe it should be, but I'm saying it isn't. Does anybody think I'm being overly cynical here or wrong? Anybody have any thoughts about that? No, you're all as cynical as I am.
Well, it's probably a continuum. You've got on one end of the scale guys like that George Santos, I think that's his name.
Yeah, the guy from Florida. Or
I thought he was up in the New England.
oh, that's right.
New York. He's from New York. George.
Yeah, you're right.
Isn't that? I mean, like he would be a good case of the worst possible, corruption liar that you can come up with. But I mean, they're not all that bad. So there's a tendency to look at this black and white, but I don't. I think it's a continuum. But they're probably all somewhat corrupt.
Right. Right. But if you're going to be a representative for a large portion of the electorate, then even a little bit of lying on your part goes a long way to corrupt the system. Because what you're doing is affecting. You're not just doing it for yourself. You're doing it for many others, and that's why it only takes ordinary liars, not exceptional liars, just plain old people that are no worse or no better than the average voter to be in office for this corruption to happen. And that's the point, because in other words, here's another way to put it. A million small-time liars can do more harm than a few bad apples who are over, extreme liars, because of the sheer numbers and the effect it has on, especially in representative governments.
Well, also politicians are good at not getting caught lying.
Right. Well, that leads to another point that I talk about in the write-up, and that is education and intelligence. Fact is that there was I remember as a kid hearing people talk about crime not pay. That but it's not true. If you're going to rob liquor stores, yes, chances are eventually you're going to get caught and things are not going to go well for you. But if you get a good education with a 4-year college degree or more, and then you decide to take up crime and you use your intelligence for it, chances are you're not going to see the inside of a jail. That's what criminologists tell us about white collar crime. Only 10, it's 10 by a factor of 10 is more costly to society. White collar crime is crime by people with college educations or more than the street crime that you hear about on 65 News. That kind of crime is what everybody thinks of when they think of crime, but the cost to society is much higher from the kind of crime that highly educated, knowledgeable people do. In terms of the cost, how much of our national resources go into funding, having to pay for this. Think of the 2008 financial crisis and other things like that, where big people made big money and very few people went to jail, and a lot of people's lives were affected by it. Whereas if you rob a liquor store, you're not going to get much money from it, and you probably are going to get caught if you keep doing it. So, there's no correlation, in other words, between necessarily being highly knowledgeable and educated and being necessarily ethically good or less likely to be a criminal. It's not obvious. But what there is a correlation is between the kind of crime we do. People with college educations generally don't rob convenience stores. They would find some other kind of way of committing crime than that way. There are intelligent crimes and not so intelligent crimes. And it's the not so intelligent ones that get all the attention that appear on the 6 o'clock news. Anyway, and politicians, well, I mean, does anybody think that, what's his name, Trump is going to go to jail? I don't know. I kind of doubt it. If it was somebody who wasn't in his position, with the financial power, the connections he had and has, tried to do what he did, I'm sure they would have been in jail. Or for that matter, many other politicians. I'm just picking on Trump. I'm not actually, I'm no supporter of Trump, but I do think, I could easily come up with names of people who were against Trump, who I think were equally as bad as Trump was. So I don't, well, anyway, I shouldn't go there. But the point is, there are lots of reasons why the kind of representation we currently have in government is liable to be corrupted. Even if you really had genuine, it's almost like if you be careful what you wish for, because if you get genuine representatives of the people of the electorate, you're going to get a high percentage of them being easily liable to corruption, because that's what it means to be to represent correctly. Unless you just happen to pick out saints and absolutely angelic people, and just those people don't run for office, and if they do run, they don't get elected. Anyway, so enough on that.
I had one comment real quick.
Go ahead.
Like when you're talking about whether Trump would get sent to jail or not, back in the in the Nixon era, some of his group did get sent to jail.
Yeah.
Spiro Agnew, I think, and a guy that my grandfather knew, Earl Butts, who was the Secretary of Agriculture. He was in the Nixon administration. They got caught on their taxes, I think, or Spiro Agnew was taking money. Anyway, there was corruption. So, but I guess my point is that sometimes people will get sent to jail, politicians, but it's rarely the top one, the president.
Yeah. Right.
But they do go to jail sometimes.
Yeah. Well, historically, there of course have been leaders who got their heads cut off, but that hasn't happened in a long time. But
there's something about the president that almost makes it hit her or him, exempt.
Right. Yeah. Well, that's interesting. And why is that? I mean, why is it just built into the Constitution, or something about the American mindset?
Part of the problem is I don't think we've ever gone there in our history.
Yeah. Or is it because, say, unlike a king, like during the French Revolution or other revolutions where presidents or leaders have been killed in revolutions. Well, you could say that that was attempted in U.S. history. Think of the assassination of Lincoln. Although I'm not sure how much his assassin was. Can somebody remind me about what his motive was? Was it that he had a political motive, or was it something else?
I think it was political because he was from the South.
Right.
It was Lincoln's assassin.
Right.
I think he was an actor, a Southern origin.
Right. But yeah. Well, anyway, so the next topic, part of this, unless somebody wants to say more about this, that I want to talk about is the transparency things. Okay, one of the ways that people sometimes say that we can fix things is to hold bad politicians or bad policymakers accountable. And accountable, like as in, what does that mean? Does it mean that you vote them out of office at the next election? Surprisingly, 85% of everybody who gets elected to Congress gets reelected. If you take that seriously, you might get the impression that people thought the government is doing a good job 85% of the time because they keep saying people get reelected. So you keep the same bums instead of replacing them with different bums. It must be because they're doing a good job. But that surveys show that's not the case. People are just don't think that in general the government, the U.S. Congress is doing a good job. Has a very low popularity rating, and yet those people keep being reelected. So the accountability by being kicked out of office doesn't seem to work. So what other kinds of accountability could there be? Part of it is, this is a general principle about accountability. Before you can hold anyone accountable, you have to know what's going on. You need something called transparency. And the system has gotten very good at keeping things opaque and not letting you know what they don't think it's in your interest to know, or their interest for you to know. And these are obstacles to accountability. And whenever there is someone who comes along and really spills the beans, so to speak, on very important, powerful institutions, they pay a price. And this is where that picture of Julian Assange comes up. That's what happened to him. And when you hear the whole story, there's a link in the resources to the whole story. And basically, he's in jail right now in the UK after spending several years hiding out in the Ecuadorian embassy, I believe, the UK. But he's been basically a pawn, being harassed, and to the point where a lot of people would like to see him dead, by the US government for having revealed some pretty nasty information about how the United States treated people in the Middle East during the wars there in recent times. And you can learn more about that. I'm not going to get into the details of that, but and he's not the only example of this. If someone does threaten a power concentration with transparency, they will be shut down. Yeah, in his case, it was pretty extreme, but in more subtle ways in recent times, through things like being labeled disinformationist or spreading misinformation, or being smeared by these concentrations of power have tremendous resources to work with. A lot of the mainstream media is in their pockets, so they have a lot of control over how the public at large perceives anyone who they fear is a threat. But it's often these people that are threatening them through simply spreading information is suppressing transparency, which in turn makes accountability impossible, and also pours cold water on anyone who might be thinking about revealing anything about that they know that could negatively affect a concentration of power. They probably should think twice what they have could really harm that concentration's interest. So this is another mechanism in which these concentrations of power are built and maintained and augmented. They're simply not accountable, not through elections, not through being revealed or exposed, because all the avenues of exposure are in their control as well. And again, it just emphasizes how deep and entrenched these concentrations of power, which then raises the next question is, what, if anything, can any of us even collectively do about it? Okay, does anybody have any thoughts about this? Anybody? No? You all agree with me? Or it must be somebody here who thinks that maybe I'm
Well,
exaggerating.
it's a big problem. I don't know that we have the answers. It's just a big
Yeah.
problem.
Well, okay. Yeah, we're getting toward the end here, but I do want to kind of sum up where we've been and why we're doing this, because in the next topic, the one on we're going to explore, okay, what can be done about this, if anything. Some of the solutions that are going to be proposed there are pretty radical, and radical in the sense that that we don't have any history of having tried those things before that I know of on the scale in which we need to do it. And so immediately people are going to say, well, that'll never work, because they just don't see a path from where we are now to there. And they may be right, because we're assuming that the things I've been talking about the past several meetups are true. It does seem that these power concentrations are deeply entrenched, and there's nothing that any one of us, and it's even hard to see, short of some kind of mass violent revolution, that anything that we could do, anything we could do about it. So that's a serious problem, and that's why now historically, it could be that things aren't that bad yet. You could say that whoever's in power right now, these concentrations of power are, at least so far, treading fairly astutely and carefully. They are exploiting us, but they're not doing it too explicitly or too oppressively, without giving us something, giving us a few morsels of encouragement every now and then. For example, passing some reform package that makes people think, oh, they are doing something after all. That it could be that what we have is an oligarchy, not a democracy. And it could be it's a wise oligarchy that knows how to preserve itself, and it knows what's good for it. It knows that it can't push things too far too fast, or it will piss off enough people that heads will roll. But the art of governance, they must be thinking, is to exploit the public, but in such a way that they don't there's no mass uprising. Just keep them in line. And occasionally you have to toss them a morsel to make them believe in the system. But you don't want to push things so far that they really start rebelling en masse. So that's one way. So what could possibly, where could this all possibly go? Will this still be the same 100 years from now, or will something happen? Well, perhaps the future is more of the same. Perhaps it'll just keep going the way it is going now. And as long as the power concentrations are able to keep the illusion that we're some kind of democracy in which in some way or other, government really does represent what most people want, even if it doesn't, but the trick is to get them to believe that it does. And if they can continue to keep people believing that, and it appears they must be, because the vast majority of people still, Americans, I think, still don't either are unaware of or don't want to hear about what we have been talking about these past few sessions. Or maybe we're just plain wrong and they're right. I'm not saying that I know for a fact that everything I've been talking about is absolutely true, but there are reasons why people, even people who are against power concentrations, might have motives for wanting to see them brought down that may not be necessarily the best motives, but still, there's a lot of problems, and I've been focusing primarily, I wanted to focus on the conceptual problems because this is a philosophy group, not really political. So I started out by trying to understand what it means, what a democracy, the word means, what it's supposed to mean, and how far removed we are from that, what the alternatives are, oligarchy, autocracy, and so forth, what representation is, what, in theory, elections are supposed to do for us. They're supposed to be a way to achieve representation, proxy representation. This is where you have a intermediate government. So that's been the focus so far, and showing how messed up that system is. So then either it's going to keep going the way it is for a while until they manage to find the perfect sweet spot of exploitation without doing it too much and keep it. But maybe it could go on like this for a long time. I suspect it won't go on forever. I think it's just from history. People will overstep their bounds at some point, and then there will be something's going to change. So leaving out violence for the moment, is there something else that could be done? And that's going to be the focus next time. And the two obvious choices are, the one everyone's heard of is reform the system. Why not get rid of gerrymandering and make lobbying illegal and have more sophisticated voting schemes instead of winner past the post or first past the post elections, instead have elections like some other slightly more enlightened democracies have, where you can rank the people that are running for office. Let's say there were 4 or 5 political parties, and you could vote for your first choice, second, third, and fourth. And if you didn't get your first choice, your second choice would get your vote, so on. Some people think that this would be this would help make voting more effective, more meaningful. That's the word I was looking. So anyway, that's one possibility. But as I've been pointing out this time, what we're up against seems to be such powerful concentrations of power. It just seems hard to see how that's ever going to happen. That reform. Just a moment. Okay, then the other alternative, and this is the one that some people will, I'm sure, roll their eyes at, because it would be such a radical change from anything we have an experience of on a scale of millions of people. And that is, I'll talk more about it in detail, how it would work, including the objections to it and how they could be overcome and what stands in the way of it, and try to explain at least some models of how that would make it seem at least plausible, whether plausible that it would work, maybe not plausible how we would get there here. And that is ditching elections altogether in trying to achieve representative democracy in some other way other than through elections. And the only way I know of that I've heard of alternative is something called sortition or plutocracy. And this is basically the idea that we get rid of the Congress as an elected body and replace it with a different kind of representation, the kind that actually is familiar from scientific research, and that is to choose random samples of the target population and test your ideas, try to get a feel for what the target population thinks about something by sampling that with a significantly large enough sample of that population, and then having them make the laws. These people would not be elected. They wouldn't run for election. Unlike the politicians now who have to spend 70% of their time in office worrying about raising money to be reelected, these people would be there for a designated period of time. They could not make a career of being politicians. It would just be, in theory, people off the street, just anybody who would be given the opportunity, not required to, but given the opportunity to serve their country. They would be well paid. This is important. They would have to be paid well enough that they don't have the same kind of pressures that we all know about from those of us who've been familiar with the jury system, people cannot be expected to drop what they're doing for the period of time suggested was something like 3 years of service to their country, quit what they're doing, go do that, and without being well compensated for their time. But they would be expected for at least 3 years to take their role as lawmakers really seriously. And anyway, well, there are all kinds of problems with this scheme, but there are possible solutions to it, and we'll talk about that next. And before we quit today, does anybody have any final thoughts here about this? Nobody? All right. Okay. Okay. All right then. So, okay, thanks everybody. Then we'll close down right now. And the next meetup was, I think, April 30th. And it will be at the same time as this one, even though if you go there, it might say a different time. That's because of the way meetup presents times to people in different time zones. But it will be at the same, on a Sunday at the same time as this one. Okay.
Thanks, Victor. Good,
Sure.
good work.
Yeah.
Good job.
All right. Thanks. Thanks. Well, to all of you.
Thanks a lot.
Okay, bye.
Mhm.